All right, welcome to the second in our series on Microsoft Forms to Planner tasks with Power Automate. In the last video, we showed how to create a very simple flow that just created a task based on a form submission. We set the due date, the start date, set an importance or a priority on it, and added a description. In this video, we're going to talk about assigning those tasks, because as great as it is to create the tasks easily from a form, you probably also want to be able to assign those tasks. Now, in many cases, you might be having end users fill out that form who don't know who the task should be assigned to, and that's fine. So you can probably skip this video if that's the case. But we're going to assume that they might have some idea who it should be assigned to, so that's what we're going to take a look at. Now, in terms of that assigned to field in the create a task option, or action rather, basically it is not required, but if it is populated, it does need to contain a valid email address. Now, the hint text in the field says user ID, but in the realm of Office 365 or Microsoft 365, user ID is the person's email address, whatever email address they use to sign in to their Office or Microsoft 365 account. So that's what we need to use to populate that field. Now, whoever you assign it to also needs to have access to that plan in Planner, which means they need to be a member of the group, because plans are associated with groups. Basically, it means that you can't just arbitrarily assign the task to Bob Jones if Bob Jones is not a member of the team. Your flow will fail. So you need to make sure that however you're going about assigning people to these tasks, or assigning the tasks to users, that those users are members of the team. If you have multiple assignees and you can assign a single task to, I believe it's up to 10 people, you need to separate each of those people's email addresses with a semicolon. We're not actually going to show a multi-person assignment today, but just know that if you do need to do that, you need to separate those by semicolons. All right. So how on the form do we want to have people select how the task should be assigned? Because what we need to put into the field in Flow or Power Automate is an email address. But if we put email addresses on the form, people may not recognize those. In other words, it depends on how your organization, the convention they use for email addresses. In my development tenant, the format is first initial, last name at domain.com. However, other organizations might use some combination of initials and numbers and various things. So someone might have an email address of abc123 at domain.com, but the person filling out the form doesn't know that that is Arnold Brian Cohen at domain.com. So you want to provide them either the names of the people. If they're going to know the names, then using names is great. But probably more relevant or more useful is the role or the category for the task. So in other words, if you're publishing this forms for everyone in your organization to fill out, and let's say it's a request form to have something fixed, they're not necessarily going to know that it's that you need a plumber or a carpenter or a electrician. So having them select, or letting them select those categories or those roles on the form, is another way to match them up to the appropriate person. And then essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take whatever name or role they select on the form and match that up to the associated email address or addresses. And you could do multiples, but we're going to keep it simple and have a single email address. Now, how do we actually do that lookup in Power Automate? And there are two ways we're going to show, two methods, two options. And well, these aren't the only two options, but they're the two I'm going to show because they're, I think, the two most the two cleanest options. You can use an array or a table that's declared in the flow. So we're going to create an array variable in the flow, and that will have names and email addresses and the names are going to match the name choices on our form. So people, when they select a name on the form, it'll be assigned to the email address associated with that name in that table in the flow. The other option, which is a little more flexible, if you know that you're going to be that maybe the people associated with these, especially if you're using roles or categories, then you'll want to store that in an external source, because then as people change, as the person associated with that role or person doing that job changes, you don't want to have to open up your flow to change code in essentially what is code in the flow. You want to change the data source. So go to your SharePoint list and remove one person and put in a different person. So that's what we're going to go with for the external data source. We're going to look it up in a SharePoint list. So first off, let's take a look at our form. And it's the same form we used in the previous video, the Create Planner Task form. And we'll see that we added two questions here. We added assign to with names of Robert, Peter, and James. Easy enough. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to assume at first that people are going to assign it based on a person's name. So to accommodate that, we're going to go over to our flow and let's edit our flow. And I've already added in the various components here, so I'm just going to kind of walk you through what's here rather than spending the time building them out. So this, first off, is our array. And just to kind of give you a bigger view of that, I'll jump over to my PowerPoint. This is what this array looks like. We have square brackets to start the array. Ignore the bullet points here. But square bracket, curly brace, and then each object in array. This is an array of objects where we have two values, two properties, property of name and a property of email. So essentially what we're going to do is filter this array to say, give me the record where the name matches what the person selected on the form. So looking in our flow, here is our assign task from array scope. And again, I like using scopes just to keep things kind of contained and clean. And the first thing we're going to do is filter that variable array, or array variable, called var team member emails. And we're using the item property. So return from that array only records where the name property, so item basically means the element in the array, and then we're specifying the name property. So bring me back the records from, or the elements from that array where the name is equal to the assigned to response on the form. So pretty simple, pretty basic, nothing too exciting. Now, what this is going to do, when this filter array action basically takes one array and returns a smaller array. So it returns, if you have an array of ice cream flavors and you want to filter it to only those that include chocolate, you might have 5 different flavors of ice cream that include chocolate in the name. You're going to still have a list of 5 items. Or if it's only one item, so strawberry, let's say there's only one strawberry ice cream, it's still being presented as an array. So what that means is we need to remember that it's still presented as an array, and we're going to use, in this case, the first expression. Let me just blank this out and we'll build it from scratch just so you can see kind of how it works, what it looks like. So we're going to go to expression and type in first, which first is going to bring us the first element in the array. So what I want, the first element of what array? Well, I want the first element of the output of this filter. So I'll go to dynamic content, go to filter, select body. Now, if I just do this, it's going to return me both the name and the email address. All I want is the email address. So what I need to do is at the end of this, I'm going to put in a square bracket, single quote, and the word email, because as I showed over here, that is the identifier, that's the key for the email address. So easy enough. Click OK. Let me just make sure here. And now in our create a task, we need to basically say, okay, assign this task, not expression, but I want to look for the output. So here's our compose assigned from array. Select the outputs there, hit save. And let's go in and preview this so we can create a task. And I'll call this task for James. We'll select assign to James. And we'll leave category blank. But we'll say the start date is going to be the 21st. The due date will be the 24th. And we'll say that that is, it's a number 4. Oh, forgot to add a description. Something for James to do. Keep forgetting that description. So we'll submit that. Go over to our flow. And hey, that succeeded. And just to kind of verify that it did what we wanted to, we can look at our scope. We can see that it filtered from this array input. It returned the output of James Kinslow's record. And then in our compose assigned to array, it returned just the email address of James. So now if I go over to our plan here, there is a task for James that is important and assigned to James. Beautiful. All right. So that is the simple assign it to a person. Let's talk about the other way of assigning that task, which is a little more flexible and maybe a little more practical for a lot of people, and that is by category. So in our case, we're going to assume that all tasks fall into one of these 3 categories of management, operations, and research. And we know that we have sort of one person, and we're keeping it simple by saying one person. It could be multiple people, but for right now, let's say one person who is the head of management or the head of operations or the head of research. And we want to be able to, the person filling out the form is going to say, you know what, this sounds like a research task. So they'll select research and it'll assign it to whoever is associated with research. Now, the way we're going to do that, we could do as we did with the names, we could build an array in the flow, but I don't want to do that because then every time that research person changes, you have to open the flow up and change the array. Instead, I want to make it easier for people to update that information later. So we're going to use a list in SharePoint. So I created a list here called task assignees, which has a title column, and that the values in that title column match the choices in our question, our category question on the form. So management, operations, research. And then our assignee column is a person column in SharePoint. And it's important to note this is a person column because a person column is a complex column type in SharePoint. So it doesn't just have the person's name. Even though what you're seeing is their name, it has their name, it has their email address, it has a bunch of other information in their record in the directory. So we're going to need to think about that and so that we know how to extract just their email address. All right, so we've got our list, we've got our assignees. Let's start working with this. Now the first thing I want to do in our flow is I'm going to edit this, and just to prevent it from coming back to bite us, I'm going to delete this scope since we're done with that for the time being, which also means that we've deleted the I want to clear out that assigned to user IDs. We're going to come back and fix that later. All right, so in our scope, we first have a get items action. So we're getting items from a SharePoint list. So we give it the site name or site address, the list name. Now, people have a tendency when they're getting items from SharePoint to say, well, I'm going to get everything from SharePoint, bring all this data into my flow, and then I'm going to either filter it down or perform some operation on every item. And that'll work in a lot of cases, but there are other situations where it won't. It's also really inefficient. It's kind of like saying, well, I'm not sure which loaf of bread I want to buy at the supermarket, so I'm going to buy all of them, bring them all home, and then I'll pick which one I want, and I'll take the other ones back. It's inefficient. So what we want to do is open up the advanced options, and we have this filter query field. What this allows us to do is say, return from that list, go to that list, and just bring me back the items that meet this criteria. So in this case, we're going to say, bring back the items where the title column, the value that's in the title column, is equal to the category that they selected on the form. So in other words, if someone comes to the form and selects management, I want it to bring back just the one record from that list, which is management. Not overly exciting, but really important concept to understand. Just bring back the data that you need, and your life will be much easier. All right, so that's going to bring back that item, but it's bringing back the whole item, and on top of that, it's also treating that item or treating that output as an array, because even though it's only going to bring one, it might bring 5. So because it could bring back multiple items, it's going to format it as an array, which means we need to handle it as an array. Now, we have a couple different ways to do that. First off, what I want to do is get just the email address of the assignee. So let me just do a save here just to be sure that it's getting the appropriate schema. And then what I'm going to do is add a select action. Select is an action from the data operations connector, which basically allows you to go to an array of data and bring back specific columns or specific values from those columns. So in our case, we're going what array do we want? Let me just rename this. So select from items in assignee list. So we want to get the value from that list of values. We want to return what? Now, by default, it wants you to enter a key like email, and then you would select task assignee email. The problem here is that the way it's going to format it, it makes our life a little more complicated. So what I'm going to do is basically get rid of that, go into our array edit mode, or text mode rather, and just eliminate that and eliminate that. And what we're going to end up getting back from this is simply the email of the task assignee from that record of that list. Now, as with the filter array, it's still going to be formatted in an array format. So it's still going to be as if it were multiple values. So we need to flatten that out. And the way we're going to do that, there are a couple ways to do that. But we showed how to use the first before. I want to show you a slightly different way, and that is, it's also going to be in a compose action. But what we're going to use is the join expression. And join is basically saying, take the values from this array and glue them together in this format or with this delimiter. Now we're only getting one item, so it's only going to be sticking one item together, but it's another way to do it. And this would be handy later on if you did decide that you wanted to have multiple assignees. You'll need to use this join. Well, don't need to, but it's a valuable way to do it, or a useful way. So we'll select join, and we want to join the select output and I want to join it with a semicolon. So single parens, semicolon. So there we go, we've got join. Now incidentally, there is also a join action. So we could say, if you search for join, you'll find the join data operation, and you could do it that way as well. But we're going to stick with using the join expression. There we go. And we'll just rename this to compose category assignee. There we go, from list. All right, so now we're going to go down to our create a task, and we're going to plug in the output of compose category assignee from list, outputs, save. Okay, and now we will go over, fill out our form, and see what happens. Alright, so in this case what we're going to do is fill out our form again. We're still in preview mode. We're going to call this a, let's say manage, it's going to ask me to sign in again. Management task 1, and we're going to skip the assign to, but we're going to say we know this is a job for management. And we'll set the start date to 7 and the end date to 11 and say this is a manager's task. And we'll say maybe it's medium. So we'll give it a number 5, hit submit. Review our flow, and fingers crossed, it succeeded. Beautiful. So let's take a look at what actually happened inside the flow run here. So here's our scope assigned from SP list. We can see that we got items from the assignee list, and if we look at the outputs, we'll see this big ugly string is what it returned. Let's not worry too much about that, because we can look at the select items. But here we can see that from this, again, this was the output. It was filtered to management, and we can see that the select action brought back the email address. But we can tell by the square brackets that it's an array. Even though it's an array of one thing, it's still an array. So then in our compose action here, we basically said, okay, join together all of the elements of this body with a semicolon, because there's only one, there's no semicolon. Pretty simple, straightforward. So now if we jump over to our plan here, let me just go over to files, and we'll go back to the plan to refresh it. And there is management task, and it's assigned to Robert Hogan. Beautiful, because we know over in our task assignees list, management is Robert Hogan. Now maybe in a future video we'll talk about adding, basically using multiple assignees here, because going back to one example I threw out there was something like a facility, like a repair form. Your categories might be electrical, or electrician, plumber, carpenter, and you might have 5 electricians and 3 plumbers and 4 carpenters, and maybe you want to assign the task to all of those people, and then one of them will complete it. Not the most efficient way to manage tasks, but hey, it's a way to do it. So we'll come back and look at that in a future video, but for right now you know how to do it, basically using an array variable in the flow itself, and using a SharePoint list. Yep, so basically in your SharePoint list, you've got title column, person column, get the items, select the email address, join them, and you're good to go. So hopefully this was useful to you. If you do have any questions, please throw them in the comments below, and look forward to video number 3, where we will jump into creating some checklist items. So checklist items in a task are really useful for kind of spelling out what needs to get done. And we'll show a couple different ways to do that in Power Automate. So tune in, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks and have a great day.